ask you for the next half hour to do something a little hard. I want you to pretend that we're not in the middle of a presidential election. In fact, let's just for a half an hour pretend that immigration is not an incredibly controversial and volatile issue. What will we be talking about then? And I want to sort of go through a little bit calmly and honestly, what are the issues around immigration and where are we today? So let's take a little bit of a long view. This is immigration. So this is the total population. The green bars are the total. I hope you don't mind. I'm a think tank kind of guy. I guess I have a bunch of graphs to show you. This is the total population of the United States from 1850, when there were 23 million people in the country, till today, 321 million. And then that gray line shows the immigrant share of the population. And what you can see is we're near the peak of where we were around the time of Ellis Island, right? So those three peaks around the late 19th century and early 20th century at 15%. That was the highest immigrant share of the population that we've ever had. Today we're at 13.5%, so almost back at that same level. It's a historic time. And it's a complicated time. I think there are real challenges around integrating immigrants, real challenges that they face, and real challenges we face as communities, and also real strengths and benefits that we get from the immigration that's here, just as we can see in retrospect was true from 100 years ago. I think we generally, as a country, are very proud of the fact that we had all this immigration and were able to grow and thrive as a country as a result of that at the time of Ellis Island. If you were born, I'll put it this way, if you were growing up as I was in the 60s and 70s, you may think, so that's the low point of that immigrant share there. You may think of America as a place where, or you might have thought in your childhood at least of America as a place where, 5 or 6%, that was about about normal for the country. If you grew up as my grandmother did at the time, early 20th century, you would think that something very different, right? That immigration today is actually not even really quite what it was then. I think if you just think about who immigrants are, so when we talk about immigrants at the Fiscal Policy Institute, we follow kind of the standard in social science literature. So we're talking about people who are born in another country who are living in the United States. So we're not including the second generation. That's an interesting separate conversation. We're not including people from Puerto Rico, for example, who were born in the United States because Puerto Rico is part of the United States. We're also including people who may be on temporary visas, but everybody who was born in another country and in the United States today. So a lot of those are people who are undocumented or unauthorized immigrants. Those numbers have gone up quite a lot over the years. So in 1986, we had an immigration reform and, in fact, amnesty signed by Ronald Reagan that basically kind of wiped the slate clean, but we didn't have a very good sense of how to deal with the enforcement and future flows of immigration after that. So undocumented immigration grew pretty quickly through the 90s and up until 2000, went from 4 million to 9 million to now about 11 million. It's interesting to note that it's relatively stable at 11 million right now, whether that's because of the economy or because of enforcement. That's where we are, is it's about 11 million. So that's about a quarter of all of the immigrants in the country. There are 43 million immigrants altogether. About a quarter of them are undocumented. So undocumented immigrants, a big part of the picture, but far from the whole story. So I know that this is too small for you to read the details. You can look on our website if you wanted to see in detail what this is. But the point I wanted to make here is that immigrants are in a much wider range of jobs than I think is commonly understood. So down towards the bottom, you have farm workers, and in sort of the bottom middle, people working in construction jobs and blue-collar jobs. And these are areas where, if you can see, at 16%, this sort of a looks like a little bit lighter gray line than I thought it was, is where everybody would be if they were evenly distributed, completely exactly evenly distributed across all of the occupations. So you see, there are some areas where immigrants are above that share, some where immigrants are below. There are not that many where they really stand out, actually, or at least not so dramatically. So in personal services, in homes, quite high, in farming, quite high, in some of the blue-collar jobs. Also among professionals, doctors and professional specialties. And the only one that I would say where immigrants are really dramatically underrepresented is firefighters, police, and security people. So we did something along these lines. We looked at those top jobs, the white-collar jobs, and said, what share of immigrants are in white-collar jobs? And we actually got quite a lot of attention for this. There was a front-page story in the New York Times where we said that the majority of immigrants in most metro areas are in white-collar jobs, more than in blue-collar and service jobs combined. And we have a fantastic academic advisory panel, economists and sociologists who are world-renowned, who I'm very proud of. And they looked at that and they said, well, obviously, right, that's what the American economy is. Why would you be surprised about that? So we thought, well, I thought people might be interested anyway. So we put it out, and in fact, it became this one of the biggest news stories we've had around our work. Because I think people have the expectation that that's not the case, that those 20 guys that they see on the street corner, that represents immigration. And of course, that's a part of the story of immigration, but it's in fact a fairly small part of the kind of immigration we're getting in the United States today. That said, I wanted to dig a little bit deeper to say, so when we talk about immigrants, we're talking about quite a diverse group, in fact. And then this is ranked by the share of immigrants in the labor force from different countries. And so one way you can divide it up is to say, what countries do people come from? And what you see is the dark share there is what's the percentage of people in white-collar jobs from each of these countries, right? So when I was saying before, immigrants are mostly in white-collar jobs, that's all of them combined, right? So in Mexico, the share is pretty low. From Ecuador, Dominican Republic, and Haiti, all have quite low share of immigrants in white-collar jobs. But on the other hand, India, Philippines, China, Korea, Taiwan have quite high share of immigrants in white-collar jobs. So college, of course, is a huge help. College education raises incomes for every group across the board. It's not the only reason that people should be going to college, as I think both Wes and Richard said, but it's obviously an important consequence, right? And so if you look at people who have a BA degree to people who, and this is people whose highest degree is a BA, so it doesn't include the people who've gone on to beyond that, a BA degree to people who have a high school degree. Across the board, you see, so this is immigrant women have a higher level of earnings than those with a high school degree. And immigrant men, similarly, right, quite a higher level for those who have a college degree than a high school degree. But you'll surely have noticed also that there are pretty big differences across the different groups here. So these are the American, sort of standard American racial and ethnic groups. So black, white, or white, black, Hispanic, and Asian. White men have by far the highest level of earnings, even once you've already said, we're just talking about people with a college degree. So it's not just about education. So here's a little bit about what is that was looking at immigrants. What's the context that immigrants are coming into? Right? And so one way to think about it is, let's take the white US-born men and use that as a kind of a measuring stick and say, how are other groups doing in relationship to them? So what you see is nobody's up to the level of white US-born men. This is just people with a college degree, right? So it's not about education. Asian, US-born Asians are the closest. US-born Asian men. Hispanic men coming next. In every level, you see women doing considerably less well than men. In fact, the biggest gap between men and women is among US-born white men and women. So that's the US-born, right? So what do the immigrants look like? So here's immigrants by the same white, black, Hispanic, Asian, and men and women. And what you see is, I would say, a pattern that pretty much mirrors the US-born. So why is that? Well, it may be that there are differences among the different groups as they come in. Surely there are. But also, it's hard not to see this and think that maybe there's, that there's as much of a difference, let's say at least, based on race as there is based on nativity. That it may matter as much whether you're white, black, Hispanic, or Asian coming into this country as whether you're US-born or an immigrant. So among the immigrants, white men are still the highest, actually making a little bit more than, on average, than US-born white men. Asian men still the second highest. still a gap between men and women in every level, except actually, interestingly, black immigrant women seem to be making almost as much as black immigrant men. So something to think about, at least, as you think about the questions about immigration and integration within your universities and colleges. So that's the national picture. And I want to say a little bit about geographic diversity, because as I'm sure you're probably thinking about in your everyday lives, there are big differences between what's going on in the different places around the country. And I think it's, there's so much national media that I feel like we often absorb the discussions in the national media as though that's reflecting what's happening locally, when in fact something fairly different might be happening locally, especially around a volatile issue like immigration. So here's another thing that our academic advisors thought was obvious and a lot of the rest of the world thought was very surprising. That when we looked at the largest metropolitan areas across the country, what we saw was that there's this very close correlation between immigration and economic growth. That where there's immigration, there's economic growth. Where there's economic growth, there's immigration. Why is that? I think for a long time there were back and forth discussions with us at least. Is it because immigrants are causing the growth, or is it that immigrants are going where the jobs are? I think it's both. I think that immigrants go someplace because there are jobs. There's no doubt that that's a draw for people to the metro areas. At the same time, I think once they're there, they start businesses. They're consumers within the economy, so they help the overall economy grow. And there's a kind of back and forth cycle to it. I also would say more and more, as we've gone through that for several years now, it's not that interesting a question. I think that we don't decide whether immigrants are going to go somewhere and then, plan accordingly. I think that people, that you have economic growth and integrate immigrants. And if you want to have growth, you need to be planning to think about immigration. So let me talk a little bit about three types of cities. So metro areas, so the cities and the suburbs together, right? Metro areas are basically all growing in the United States. Some growing faster than others, but they're pretty much all growing. There are none that are shrinking. But cities are very different. In some cities, we've seen pretty dramatic decline, and in others, we've seen pretty steady growth. So let me talk just a little bit about three different types of cities. Those that have been growing steadily without decline over the last 50 years or so. So Houston is an example of that, and Dallas, Indianapolis, San Diego. I've listed a bunch of others that fit the similar kind of profile. Those that have been declining and have not seen a rebound. So those where there was white flight, there was suburbanization, population decline, deindustrialization, and have not come back, at least to this point since then. And then some, and Buffalo is an example of that. And then Washington, D.C. as an example of those that declined, but then saw a rebound and have started to come back again. So here's Houston. Pretty steady growth throughout from 1950 until today. A little bit of trouble between 1980 and 1990. Those of you who were there, I think, know a little bit about the oil situation at that time. But what you can see is, so the top bar is the foreign-born share of the population, and the bottom is the US-born share. So most of that growth, actually, since 1980, has been about immigrants. There's been a little bit of decline in 80 to 90 in the US-born population, and then a little bit of growth since then. But most of the growth that you see overall is about immigrants. And in places like this, where there's been steady growth, including growth of immigrant populations, pretty high proportion of undocumented immigrants, about a third in the Houston metro area. Mexicans make up, by and large, the overall biggest group, 46%, so almost the majority of immigrants in Houston. El Salvador, Honduras, Guatemala, also high up there, Colombia. Although even in a place like Houston, where there's a lot of Central American and Mexican immigration, you have not very much, it's still a pretty diverse group. You have people from Vietnam, from India, China, Nigeria, Philippines, Pakistan. All those together, this is the top 15 groups, and all of them together make up the majority of the immigrant population, but you still have 17% in other groups from other countries, right? So here's what a place like Buffalo looks like by contrast, so a declining overall population. What you see is, so there's been overall decline in every decade since 1950. The immigrant share is growing a little bit at the end, so immigrant population is growing enough to begin to offset some of that loss, but still not enough to turn it around. And in a place like Buffalo, Mexico is actually not even on the top 15 list of immigrants in the city. In fact, the only Latino group, not even Central American either, is Dominicans from the Dominican Republic. The 2% of the immigrant population is from the Dominican Republic. The biggest group, by far, in fact, is Burmese, mostly refugees. Right? So there's refugee resettlement is actually a big, and in fact, so some of the other groups as well, Bangladeshis and Iraqis and Nepalese. There are a number of, there's a big refugee resettlement program in Buffalo, and it's a big part of what's helping the city to sustain its population. So Washington has seen a population rebound. Right, so you see the overall population decline, and then growth again, and immigrants again playing a big part in the revitalization or the population rebound. So in Washington, the biggest group is Salvadorans, followed by Ethiopian, Mexican third, Guatemalan, Chinese, Jamaican, Indian, and so on. A big mix of immigrants with different kinds of backgrounds. Green card holders, undocumented immigrants, refugees, asylees, student visas, temporary visas like H-1Bs. So you have a lot of different kinds of people in the city of Washington. And I think different implications, so I'll leave this for you to think about hopefully over the next, for the rest of the day and beyond. What's the role of universities and colleges in thinking about both how do you help them, those immigrants, to succeed, and also how do you help them to be integrated in a way that's good for the overall population in the city? So I don't want to suggest that population growth is necessarily desirable in and of itself. Right? We don't necessarily always need to be growing, and it's certainly not necessarily a problem for a city to be not growing, but it is a big problem for a city to be shrinking. Right? Because you have, I hear some of you nodding, right? I think, so if you have a city that's shrinking significantly, you have an infrastructure that's built for a population of, say, 1 million people. If you then have, after that, 300,000 people leave, you have all of the roads and sewers and electricity and school buildings and everything built for that population, but you have a declining tax base, right, because you have people leaving, especially if it's the middle class that's leaving, which has often been what's happened in the United States. In order to sustain the same revenues, just to even kind of keep up that stuff, you need to have higher tax rates, right, because you have fewer people paying the tax, so you end up with and that pushes people off even further, and so you have this sort of downward spiral. This is the cities with declining populations from 1960 to 1980, the time when there's when the first big population decline started happening. And at the top of that list, you see places like St. Louis had a 40% loss of population, and Cleveland, Buffalo, Pittsburgh, all about 30% or more. Right? Detroit, Rochester, Louisville, Cincinnati, places where there have been real challenges. So of the 29 cities that have had declining populations, there were 14 that increased between 1980 and 2013, 14. So here are the cities that rebounded with an increase in the immigrant population. So the immigrant is the red part on top, and the US-born is the gray on the bottom. And what you see is, in every case, immigrants are a significant part of that growth. And here are the cities that rebounded without an increase in the immigrant population. Right? There are none. Right? So that's not to say that immigrants it's not to say that immigrants drove that growth. Right? I think it's a more complicated story than that. But I think it is to say that if your plan is for your city to grow without immigrants, there are 0 examples of that happening in the last 50 years. Right? So let me wind up with, I didn't start with a joke, but I'll wind up with a joke. An engineer friend of mine, this is true, said, told the old story about, glass half empty and glass half full. He said, the optimist sees the glass as half full, and the pessimist sees the glass as half empty. But we engineers, we'll come along and we say, maybe you've got the wrong size glass. And I tell you that story as just a way of thinking about, what do we do? I don't want to say that immigration is all wonderful and there are no problems, or that there are just giant problems to have, but what are the glasses? What are the things that we can do to try to help to make sure that we get the most out of the context that we have? How do we make sure everybody can thrive? How do we make sure it's good for the populations that are already in the cities? But how do you also help to think about how do you advance the prospects for the newcomers who are here? And how can you help all of that be part of a picture of economic revival in the United States? So let me wind up with that. Thanks, and Wes, you want to come on back up?